She bought a ranch for $1, figuring it was empty, figuring wrong. The wind was still when she stepped off that wagon, deed in hand. But someone was already there, a towering Apache man, silent as the stones, standing on the porch like he'd never left. This land was never for sale, he told her. The law says it was. The truth lies somewhere between. She came west chasing peace, maybe purpose. But the land doesn't forget. There's history in the dirt, grief in the walls, and a grave out back that no one speaks of. Now whispers rise in town. The railroad eyes the land. The fire's coming, and she stands in the middle of it all. She only wanted a place to start over. But she found something deeper. And someone the world tried to erase. What's the real price of $1, when the past is still alive? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today? And how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the New Mexico territory as Clara June Mallory's stagecoach rattled into Owl's Rest. Her hands, weathered from years of chalk dust and washing boards, clutched the deed paper folded carefully inside her mother's Bible. The leather-bound book had been her constant companion through every trial, and now it carried her future within its pages. The stagecoach driver called out, "Owl's Rest Station!" His voice was gruff but not unkind. Clara gathered her simple black skirts and stepped down onto the wooden platform, her boots raising small puffs of dust. Her valise, though not heavy with possessions, carried the weight of her hopes. The town sprawled before her, a collection of adobe and wooden buildings that seemed to fade into the vast desert beyond. A general store, a telegraph office, and what appeared to be a saloon lined the main street. Clara straightened her spine, remembering the posture she'd taught countless young ladies back in Kansas. "Excuse me," she addressed a young boy, lounging against the livery stable wall. "I need transportation to the old McDonald Ranch." The boy, no more than 16, pushed his hat back and squinted at her. "That old place?" "Ain't worth the trip, Mom. Been empty since—" He stopped, something flickering across his sun-browned face. Clara pulled out her deed. "I've purchased it through the county auction. $1. She didn't mention how she'd saved that $1 from her teaching wages, penny by penny. The boy, Tommy, according to the livery stable owner who emerged, shifted uncomfortably. "Pa, she wants to go out to McDonald's." "That's so." The older man studied Clara with concerned eyes. "Ma'am, perhaps you'd rather look at some property closer to town?" "No, thank you," Clara replied firmly. "I have the deed right here, and I aim to see my property before sunset." After several minutes of quiet argument and Clara's insistence, Tommy hitched up an old wagon. The wooden seat was hard, and every bump in the rutted trail sent jolts through Clara's tired body. She watched as Owl's Rest grew smaller behind them, the desert stretching endlessly ahead. The 2-hour journey passed in relative silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and Tommy's occasional muttered directions to the horses. Clara used the time to study the landscape. The scrubby brush, the distant mountains painted in shades of purple, and the vast sky that seemed closer here than it ever had in Kansas. When they finally crested a small rise, Clara saw it, her new home. The ranch house stood weather-beaten but solid, its adobe walls the color of sun-baked earth. A fence, listing to one side in places, marked the property boundary. The wooden porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, its boards gray with age. Tommy pulled the wagon to a stop 50 yards from the house. "Mom," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe we should—" But Clara was already climbing down, her valise in one hand and her Bible in the other. The deed crinkled softly between its pages as she walked toward her new home. That's when she saw him. He stood on the stoop, perfectly still, like he'd been carved from the very mountains she'd admired on the journey. The man was Apache, towering well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. An axe rested across one shoulder, its blade catching the late afternoon light. His feet were bare against the wooden boards, and his dark eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her stop in her tracks. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight. Behind her, she heard Tommy scrambling to turn the wagon around, the horses' hooves kicking up dust as they retreated. "Good afternoon," Clara managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Clara June Mallory." The man didn't move. Wind whispered through the scattered sagebrush, lifting Clara's skirts slightly. A lone hawk screamed somewhere overhead. "I have the deed to this property," Clara continued, pulling the paper from her Bible with trembling fingers. "Purchased through the county auction." Finally, the man spoke, his voice deep and quiet like distant thunder. "Paper means nothing." He gestured with his free hand toward a small rise behind the house. "My wife lies there. This is my home." Clara swallowed hard, looking where he pointed. A simple wooden cross stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. Fresh flowers lay at its base, their petals dancing in the evening breeze. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly, meaning it. Loss was something she understood all too well. "But I've come a long way, and I have nowhere else to go." "That is not my concern." His words were precise, careful, as if English was a tool he used sparingly. "Sir," Clara tried again, "surely we can—" "Taza," he interrupted, then added, "My name is Taza, and I am not leaving." Clara looked at the cross again, then at the house. The windows were clean, smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see the careful repairs made to the porch steps. This wasn't an abandoned property at all. It was someone's home, someone's sacred ground. "The bunkhouse," Taza said suddenly, pointing to a smaller building off to the side. "You can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow you should return to town." Clara knew she should feel afraid, alone on the frontier with a stranger who held an axe. But something in Taza's eyes spoke of pain rather than threat, of protection rather than menace. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in her own mirror after losing her son to the war. "Thank you," she said simply, gathering her skirts and walking toward the bunkhouse. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a simple room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window. It was clean, if sparse. As darkness fell across the land, Clara sat on the thin mattress, her Bible open in her lap. The deed lay between its pages, the county seal stark against the white paper. She had legal right to this land, but right and righteous weren't always the same thing. Outside, she heard the solid thunk of an axe splitting wood, then footsteps crossing the yard. A door opened and closed. Clara lit the small oil lamp on the washstand and watched shadows dance across the bunkhouse walls. Sleep would be long in coming this night, she knew. There was much to consider, her dreams of a haven for lost girls, the money she'd scraped together for the journey, the man whose grief was as tangible as the adobe walls of the house she'd thought to claim as her own. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began to pray, not for guidance about what to do tomorrow, but for wisdom to understand what was right. The wind whispered through the cracks in the bunkhouse walls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that echoed Clara's own uncertainty. The morning sun beat down on Clara's shoulders as she walked the dusty trail back to Owl's Rest. Her sturdy boots, perfectly suitable for Kansas schoolrooms, gathered fine red dust with each step. 2 hours stretched ahead of her, but she'd risen before dawn, determined to sort out this tangle of ownership that had cost her a sleepless night. A jackrabbit darted across her path, startling her from her thoughts. The desert was coming alive as the sun climbed higher, lizards skittering across sun-warmed rocks, hawks circling overhead. Clara pulled her shawl up to shield her neck from the strengthening rays. The town materialized slowly through the heat waves rising from the ground. Clara paused to catch her breath, dabbing her forehead with her handkerchief. Her lips were dry, and she regretted not bringing water for the journey. The county recorder's office occupied a narrow building wedged between the bank and the telegraph office. A bell jangled as Clara pushed open the door, stepping from bright sunlight into the musty dimness. Behind a scarred wooden desk sat Mr. Fitch, his fingers yellow-stained from tobacco, his expression as sour as month-old milk. "May I help you?" he drawled, not looking up from his ledger. "I'm Clara June Mallory. I purchased the MacDonald Ranch through the county auction." She placed her deed on his desk. "There seems to be a situation requiring clarification." That got his attention. His watery eyes lifted to study her face. "Situation?" "The property is occupied," Clara said firmly, "by a man named Taza. He claims his wife is buried there." Fitch's chair creaked as he leaned back. "That's so." He pulled out a pouch of tobacco, taking his time filling his pipe. "Property was listed legal and proper. Sales recorded right here." He tapped a finger against his ledger. "How did it come to be listed?" Clara pressed, refusing to be dismissed. "If someone was living there—" Fitch struck a match, puffing until his pipe glowed. The sweet, sour smell of tobacco filled the small office. "Listed as abandoned after Elena MacDonald passed. 2 winters ago now." "MacDonald." Clara's brow furrowed. "Was she—" "Half-breed woman," Fitch said dismissively. "Navajo mother. Took up with that Apache scout during the Troubles. Property went to auction on account of abandonment." Clara's hands clenched in her skirts. "But it wasn't abandoned. Taza was still there. Still is there." Fitch blew out a stream of smoke. "Your deed's legal, Mrs. Mallory. What you do with any squatters is your concern." "He's not a squatter," Clara said, her voice sharp enough to make Fitch blink. "He built that house. His wife is buried there." "Then you've got yourself a peculiar situation, don't you?" Fitch's tone suggested the conversation was over. "Sales recorded. Legal and proper." Clara gathered her deed, tucking it carefully back into her Bible. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Fitch." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Was Elena MacDonald a Christian?" Fitch's expression flickered. "Missionary educated. Used to teach the Indian children before she took sick. Regular at services, so they say." The bell jangled again as Clara stepped out into the harsh sunlight. Her head ached, and not just from the heat. She needed supplies. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast. But first she needed to sit down and think. The general store's porch offered a strip of shade. Clara sank onto a wooden bench, opening her Bible to fan her face. Inside she could hear voices. "That's her, the widow who bought land with an Indian ghost. Heard she paid just $1. Cursed land, if you ask me. Should have known better than to sell Christian ground to—" Clara shut her Bible with a snap and stood. The whispers didn't bother her. She'd weathered worse during the war years, when poverty had forced her to take in washing to survive. But she needed food, and the general store was the only option. Inside, the whispers died away. Clara approached the counter with her head high. "I'd like to make a trade," she said to the storekeeper. "I have some items of value." She opened her carpet bag, removing a hand-tatted lace collar and a pair of silk gloves she'd saved from better days. The storekeeper examined the items while his wife whispered urgently in his ear. Finally, he named a fair price in store credit. Clara selected carefully: coffee, flour, salt pork, beans, and enough other staples to last a week. She added a second cup and plate to her order, ignoring the raised eyebrows this caused. The sun was setting by the time Clara made it back to the ranch, her arms aching from carrying her supplies. Taza stood in the yard, splitting wood with the same axe she'd seen yesterday. He paused in his work, watching her approach. "Mr. Taza," Clara called out, setting down her bundles. "Might we talk?" He studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the porch. Clara followed him, noting how the boards had been carefully mended, the rails solidly replaced. This was no abandoned property. Every inch showed signs of care and attention. "I went to town," Clara said, settling onto a porch chair. "Spoke with Mr. Fitch at the county recorder's office." Taza remained standing, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "He told me about Elena," Clara continued softly. "That she was your wife. That she taught children." "She taught them to read," Taza said, his deep voice carrying a note of pride. "To write their names, to sing hymns." "Tell me about her?" Clara asked gently. "Please." Taza was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his words measured and careful. "Elena was Diné, Navajo. Her mother sent her to the mission school young. She learned their ways, their God." He touched the cross hanging at his neck. Clara hadn't noticed it before. "But she never forgot her people's ways. She taught me both paths could be true." He gestured to the house behind them. "I built this with my hands. Every adobe brick, every beam. Elena planted flowers. They still bloom near her grave." His voice roughened. 2 winters ago, sickness came. Nothing could save her. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Clara thought of the deed in her Bible, the county seal so official and meaningless against the weight of Taza's grief and love. "The land was never meant to be touched," Taza said quietly. "Sacred ground now. Her spirit rests here." Fat drops of rain began to fall as Clara made her way to the bunkhouse. Through the window, she watched lightning flash across the plains, illuminating the house Taza had built, the grave where Elena rested, the land that legally belonged to her but morally belonged to him. She lit her lamp and sat on the narrow bed, listening to the thunder roll across the sky. The deed felt heavy in her hands as she removed it from her Bible. Such a simple piece of paper to cause such complicated questions of right and wrong. Outside, rain drummed on the roof of the bunkhouse. Clara watched drops trace down the window glass, as conflicted as she'd ever been in her 52 years. The dawn painted the New Mexico sky in streaks of pink and gold. Clara stood at the bunkhouse door, her carpet bag packed and waiting. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning as conscience warred with practicality. The morning dew dampened her boots as she walked to where she'd tied her horse the night before. Her fingers fumbled with the reins. The mare nickered softly, breath steaming in the cool morning air. Clara secured her bag to the saddle, each movement slow and heavy. The weight in her chest grew with every step towards the fence line. She reached the gate and stopped. Beyond it lay the road back to town, to sensible choices and simpler paths. Behind her stood the house Taza had built with his own hands, where his wife lay buried beneath desert flowers. Clara's hands fell from the gate. She couldn't do it, couldn't take this man's home, couldn't disturb his wife's rest, but she couldn't simply walk away either. The land called to her, whispered of purpose and possibility. There had to be a middle path. She turned back, leading her horse toward the hitching post. Taza stood on the porch, watching. He'd likely seen her whole internal struggle, she realized with a flush of embarrassment. "Mr. Taza," she called out, squaring her shoulders, "I have a proposition for you." He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. Clara took that as permission to continue. "I won't claim the house," she said clearly, "or disturb your wife's resting place. Those are yours, sacred ground, as you said." She gestured to the bunkhouse. "I'll stay there if you'll allow it. Work only the outer fields, with your agreement. The deed may have my name, but this is your home first." Taza's expression remained unreadable, but something in his stance seemed to soften slightly. He didn't speak, didn't nod, but he turned and walked away, which Clara chose to take as acceptance. Not permission exactly, but not rejection either. She unpacked her saddlebags and set about making the bunkhouse more livable. By afternoon, the worst of the dust was cleared away, and her few possessions were arranged on the shelf. Now to see about water for washing. The well stood in the yard between the main house and bunkhouse. Clara worked the pump handle, but nothing came up except a dry wheeze. She tried again, muscles straining. Nothing. Bone dry. She started at Tarza's voice behind her. He pointed down the hill where cottonwood trees marked a line of green. Stream there. Never fails. Clara shielded her eyes, looking where he indicated. Thank you, she said, but he had already moved away, heading towards the grave site. She gathered her water bucket and began the trek down the hill. The stream gurgled clear and sweet over rocks, shaded by the cottonwoods. As she filled her bucket, movement caught her eye, a flash of copper-red fur as a fox slipped through the brush. The land was alive in ways she hadn't noticed before. The climb back up was harder, water sloshing with each step. When she reached the top, she paused to catch her breath. From here, she could see Elena's grave clearly for the first time. Simple wooden crosses marked the spot, but what drew her eye were the carvings placed among the desert flowers, small horses expertly carved from rich dark wood, their manes flowing as if in full gallop. They were beautiful, capturing the spirit of wild freedom she'd seen in the Mustang herds on her journey west. Clara looked toward the house, where Tarza sat on the porch. His hands moved steadily over a piece of wood, knife flashing in the afternoon light. She'd seen that knife at his belt before, had feared it at first. Now she understood its true purpose. As evening approached, Clara built a small fire near the bunkhouse and set a pot of beans to cook. The flames cast dancing shadows across the yard. On his porch, Tarza continued carving, his blade catching occasional glints of moonlight. They didn't speak, but the silence felt different now, less hostile, more like the quiet between people who had reached an understanding. The beans bubbled in their pot, releasing savory steam into the cool night air. Clara stirred them thoughtfully, watching sparks rise toward the stars. Across the yard, wood shavings fell like snow around Tarza's boots as another horse took shape beneath his skilled hands. They were strangers still, divided by culture and circumstance, bound together by a piece of paper and a patch of sacred ground. But they had found a way to share the space between them, and perhaps that was enough for now. Clara spooned beans into her tin plate, their warm scent mixing with wood smoke and sage. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the yard, while crickets sang in the grass and a lone coyote called in the distance. It wasn't the beginning she had imagined, but it was a beginning all the same. The morning sun cast long shadows as Clara guided her horse along the dusty trail east of the ranch. 5 miles stretched ahead to the reservation agency, a journey she'd put off for too long. Her plain brown skirt brushed against the saddle as she rode, rehearsing the words she'd say when she arrived. The agency building came into view after an hour's ride, a weathered wooden structure with a tired American flag hanging limp in the still air. 2 native women sat in the shade of the porch, weaving baskets. They watched Clara dismount without pausing their work. Inside, the air hung heavy with dust and paper. A young woman with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from her desk, fingers ink-stained from sorting documents. "I'm Miss Holloway," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "How may I help you?" Clara June Mallory. Clara smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt. "I've recently settled at the old Peterson place, and With the Apache Scout," Miss Holloway interrupted, eyebrows rising. "Word travels fast here." Before Clara could respond, a tall man entered from a side door. His face was deeply lined, his black hair streaked with grey. He wore a mixture of traditional dress and Western clothing, and his bearing commanded respect. "This is Elder Nightshade," Miss Holloway said. "He helps manage relations between the agency and the people." Naicha's dark eyes studied Clara carefully. "You are the woman who bought Tarza's land." "The county sold it," Clara said carefully. "But I've worked out an arrangement with Mr. Tarza. I'm staying in the bunkhouse, leaving the main house and burial ground untouched." Naicha's expression remained neutral. "Why are you here?" "I was a schoolteacher in Kansas for 27 years, Clara said. I'd like to offer my services, reading, arithmetic, whatever might be useful to the children." A long silence followed. Nature exchanged glances with Miss Holloway before speaking. "Many fine words have been spoken by those who came before. Few kept their promises." "I understand your skepticism," Clara said. "I don't ask for payment or recognition, just a chance to be useful." "And what do you gain from this?" Naiche's voice was sharp. Clara met his gaze steadily. "Purpose, Mr. Naiche, nothing more." Another silence stretched between them. Finally, Naiche nodded once. "You may try. 3 days each week. Miss Holloway will show you where." Miss Holloway led Clara to a small building behind the main office. Simple benches filled the room, facing a worn blackboard. As they discussed schedules, a small figure appeared in the doorway, a Navajo boy of perhaps 8 years, watching them intently. "That's Connie," Miss Holloway said softly. "He hasn't spoken since his mother died last winter." Clara smiled at the boy, but he only stared, dark eyes solemn in his round face. After a moment, he melted away like a shadow at noon. The ride home seemed shorter, hope lightening Clara's heart despite the heat. As she approached the ranch, she saw Taza on the porch. He watched her arrival, face unreadable as always, but she sensed his attention. Days fell into a pattern. 3 mornings each week, Clara rode to the agency to teach. The children were shy at first, but gradually warmed to her gentle manner. Connie came every day, silent but attentive, his quick mind showing in his careful work. Between teaching days, Clara tended to the bunkhouse and her small patch of land. She hung laundry in the morning sun, the sheets snapping like sails in the wind. While they dried, she often sat in the shade, reading scripture aloud to herself, words of comfort and guidance carrying on the breeze. Each morning, she nodded respectfully to Elena's grave as she passed. Sometimes fresh flowers appeared among the wooden horses, though she never saw Taza place them there. Taza himself remained a quiet presence, watching her comings and goings with guarded interest. He worked on his carvings, tended the grave, and disappeared for hours into the surrounding hills. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them had grown comfortable, like the pause between prayer and amen. One evening, as Clara prepared her simple supper, she noticed a new carving on Taza's porch, a deer caught mid-leap, every line capturing the grace of movement. "That's beautiful work," she said, loud enough to carry across the yard. Taza's hand stilled on the piece he was currently working. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he rose, picked up the deer carving, and walked across the yard. Without a word, he set it beside Clara's tin plate and turned away, disappearing into the barn. Clara touched the carving gently, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. It was more than a gift. It was a sign of acceptance, as quiet and profound as the man himself. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Clara's laundry fluttered on the line like prayer flags, while the evening breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. In the barn, she could hear Taza moving about, caring for the horses. On the porch, his latest carving waited unfinished, patient as the land itself. The reservation schoolroom sweltered in the late morning heat. Clara dabbed her forehead with a handkerchief as she moved between the wooden benches, checking the children's slate work. A fit of coughing drew her attention to the back corner. Little Sarah White River hunched over her desk, shoulders shaking with each harsh cough. Clara hurried to her side, placing a gentle hand on the girl's burning forehead. "Miss Holloway," Clara called. "Sarah needs to lie down." They settled the girl on a cot in Miss Holloway's office. While the clerk went to fetch the agency doctor, Sarah's grandmother arrived. Her weathered face creased with worry. "It started this morning," the older woman explained, pressing a cool cloth to Sarah's forehead, like the cough that took her sister last winter. Clara's heart clenched. She knew too well how quickly illness could sweep through the close quarters of the reservation. As she helped make Sarah comfortable, an older man appeared in the doorway. Running Bear, one of the tribal elders who often spoke with Naiche. You should ask your friend, he said to Clara, his voice low. Taza knows the healing plants in these hills. He learned from his wife's people before. He trailed off, shaking his head. Clara looked up sharply. Before what? Running Bear's expression grew distant. Before the raid, before they took his badge. He sighed heavily. He was a good scout for the army, saved many lives, until that night. What happened? Clara asked softly. Bad information, ambush, deaths on both sides. Running Bear's words came slowly, weighted with memory. They needed someone to blame. Taza was convenient. Didn't matter that he'd warned them about the danger. He touched Sarah's hand gently. Ask him about the herbs. For the child's sake. That evening, Clara stirred her bean pot over the cooking fire, watching Taza across the yard. He sat in his usual spot on the porch, hands moving steadily over a piece of wood. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground between them. Sarah White River is sick, Clara said, loud enough to carry. Running Bear mentioned you might know of plants that could help her cough. Taza's knife stilled against the wood. He didn't look up. He also mentioned your time as a scout? Clara continued carefully. Said you were treated unjustly. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Taza stood, disappearing into the house. Clara's heart sank, but moments later he emerged with something in his hand. He crossed the yard and held it out to her. A folded paper, worn at the creases, stained by water or perhaps tears. Clara opened it carefully. An army discharge letter dated 1883. The formal language couldn't disguise the bitterness of false accusations, dereliction of duty, negligence leading to casualties. Her throat tightened as she read. They were wrong, she said softly, refolding the letter. Taza took it back, tucking it into his shirt. Without a word, he walked away towards the hills. Clara watched him go, understanding now why he held himself apart, why trust came so hard. Later that night, wind began to howl across the plains. Clara lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the roof timbers creak. A particularly strong gust rattled the windows, and she heard footsteps on the porch. She opened the door to find Taza nailing boards across the windows. Rain had begun to fall, pattering against his shoulders as he worked. Let me help, Clara said, reaching for a board. They worked together in the growing storm, securing the bunkhouse windows. Thunder rolled overhead, and in a flash of lightning, Clara saw Taza's face, drawn with a grief deeper than the weather. My daughter loved storms, he said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the wind. Elena would hold her by the window, counting between lightning and thunder. His hand stilled on the hammer. She was 4 when the sickness came. Smallpox. Nothing we tried helped. Clara's heart ached. I'm so sorry. Elena. Taza's voice roughened. She stopped eating, stopped living. I buried them both here, where the morning sun touches first. His gesture encompassed the grave site, the house, the land itself. This place holds my grief, my failure to protect them, my penance. Penance? Clara asked gently. For what? For surviving. For not being able to save them. Lightning flashed again, catching the moisture in his eyes. For all of it. They finished boarding the windows in silence. Before returning to the house, Taza paused. I will show you the healing plants tomorrow. For the sick child. Clara watched him walk away through the rain, understanding now that his silence wasn't anger. It was a tomb for all the words he couldn't bear to speak. The wind howled around the bunkhouse corners, but the windows held firm, protected by their shared labor. Inside, Clara lit her lamp and opened her Bible to the Psalms, finding comfort in ancient words of lament and hope. Outside, the storm raged on, but she felt something had shifted, like the first subtle change of seasons, a thaw in the frozen ground of grief. She thought of Taza's daughter, who had loved storms, and his wife who had counted thunder, of a man who had served honorably, only to be betrayed, of graves warmed by morning sun and the weight of survival carried like stones in the heart. The lamp flickered as wind found its way through the boards. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Somewhere in the darkness, Taza kept his own vigil, surrounded by memories carved in wood and earth. But he had spoken at last, sharing his burden of loss. It wasn't trust, not yet, but perhaps it was the beginning of healing. Spring crept across the ranch like a shy visitor, touching everything with gentle fingers of green. Clara noticed the changes each morning as she walked the perimeter of the property, her boots leaving tracks in earth softened by dawn dew. Where bare dirt had stretched endlessly before, tiny shoots now pushed through the soil, reaching for sunlight. She knelt beside the sagging fence line, carefully placing wildflower seedlings into holes she'd prepared. Purple coneflower, yellow blanket flower, and bright patches of Indian paintbrush would soon mark the boundaries of the ranch like nature's own welcome sign. As she worked, she heard the steady thud of Taza's axe from the direction of the old chicken coop. He'd started clearing it 3 days ago, hauling away rotted boards and rusted wire without a word of explanation. Clara didn't ask. She'd learned that Taza's actions spoke louder than any words could. Like the wooden horse he'd left on her doorstep last week, or the fresh water bucket that appeared each morning by the bunkhouse door. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard. Several of her students from the reservation had taken to visiting after lessons, drawn perhaps by Clara's stories or the hard candy she kept in her desk. Today they clustered around the well, taking turns drawing water while the youngest ones chased grasshoppers through the spring grass. "Miss Clara!" little Mary Running Water called out. "Look what Connie brought!" Clara stood, brushing dirt from her skirts as Connie approached. The quiet boy held something in his hands, wrapped carefully in twine. He held it out to her without speaking, dark eyes serious beneath his heavy fringe of hair. "For me?" Clara asked softly. Connie nodded. When she unwrapped the twine, she found a single eagle feather, its shaft wrapped in coloured thread. Such feathers were sacred to his people. She knew this was no small gift. "Thank you, Connie," she said, holding the feather carefully. "I'll keep it safe." A ghost of a smile touched the boy's lips before he hurried back to join the others. Clara watched him go, remembering how he'd barely looked at her when she first started teaching. Now he brought her treasures, though he still rarely spoke. The afternoon sun was starting to sink when Clara finally gathered her courage and approached Taza. He was stacking the last of the cleaned boards from the chicken coop, his shirt dark with honest work. "Could we talk?" she asked, settling on an overturned bucket nearby. "About the land?" Taza paused, then nodded once, finding his own seat on a stack of lumber. "I've been thinking," Clara began, choosing her words carefully, "about how to make this right. Legal ownership of the land might be mine, but the heart of it, the history, the sacred spaces, those belong to you and your people." She took a deep breath. "What if we petitioned for joint ownership, as a tribal trust?" Taza's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "The agency clerk, Miss Holloway, she told me it's possible." Clara continued. "We could protect the gravesite, preserve the land for future generations. No one could ever take it away or claim abandonment again." A long silence followed, broken only by the distant laughter of children and the whisper of wind through spring grass. Clara waited, her hands folded in her lap, watching as Taza's gaze swept across the property, past the newly planted flowers, the half-cleared chicken coop, the children playing by the well, and finally to the grave site where Elena and his daughter rested. "Why?" he asked finally, his deep voice quiet. "Because it's right," Clara answered simply. "Because this land holds memories precious to you. Because—" she gestured to the playing children. "There's room here for new life alongside the old, but mostly because no one should live in fear of losing their home again." Taza studied her face for a long moment. "I will think on it," he said finally. Clara nodded, understanding this was neither acceptance nor rejection. She stood, wincing as a splinter from the rough bucket caught her palm. "Here," Taza said, surprising her by reaching for her hand. He produced a clean handkerchief from his pocket and carefully began wrapping it around the small wound. His large hands were gentle, capable, the same hands that carved delicate wooden horses and planted straight fence posts. "The land can hold more than ghosts," he said softly, securing the makeshift bandage. Clara's breath caught at his words. She looked up to find his dark eyes watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something like hope, fragile as a wildflower pushing through stone. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it can." The moment stretched between them, delicate as spider silk in morning light. Then Taza released her hand and stood, returning to his work. But something had shifted, like earth after rain, settling into new patterns, making room for growth. Later that evening, Clara sat on the bunkhouse steps watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The wrapped eagle feather lay in her lap, its presence a reminder of trust given and received. From the barn came the soft sounds of Taza's carving knife, shaping wood into beauty, while near the fence line, the first wildflower buds were beginning to open. The land was changing, she realized. Or perhaps it was they who were changing, learning to see beyond loss to the possibility of renewal. Like the wildflowers taking root in once barren soil, their fragile alliance was beginning to bloom. The evening wind carried the scent of spring grass and distant rain. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more careful steps toward understanding. But for now, Clara simply sat in the gathering dusk, feeling the pulse of life all around her, in the laughter echoing from the children's earlier visit, in the steady rhythm of Taza's carving, in the tender green shoots reaching toward tomorrow's sun. The morning stage kicked up dust along Owl's Rest's main street as Clara made her weekly trip into town. She balanced her basket of eggs, payment for postal services, and waved to familiar faces. 6 weeks had passed since she'd first arrived, and already the stares of strangers had softened into neighborly nods. Pastor Hobbs stood outside his whitewashed church, sweeping the steps. His weathered face creased into a smile as Clara approached. "Miss Mallory, I heard tell your school's drawing quite a crowd these days." "Indeed it is, Pastor." Clara shifted her basket. "The children are eager learners. Why, just yesterday, little Mary Running Water read an entire page from her primer without help." The pastor's eyes crinkled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing hope to that old ranch. Though ... His voice lowered. "Not everyone sees it that way. Best watch your step, Miss Mallory." Clara's smile faltered, but she nodded her thanks and continued toward the post office. Inside, Mrs. Lindell, the postmistress, was sorting mail with quick, precise movements. Her grey hair was twisted into a neat bun, and her wire-rimmed spectacles caught the morning light. "Clara, dear." Mrs. Lindell beckoned her forward. "Those fresh eggs for me, bless you, and—" She paused dramatically. "There's something here for you. A telegram arrived just this morning." Clara's heart quickened as Mrs. Lindell handed her the yellow envelope. She set down her basket and opened it with trembling fingers. The message was brief but clear. "Sister Sarah passed, stop. Ruby needs home, stop. Can you take her query? Arriving next week, if yes, stop." Clara pressed the paper to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. Poor Sarah, gone too soon, leaving 11-year-old Ruby alone in the world. But here was a chance to help, to give her niece the home she needed. Mrs. Lindell touched her arm. "Bad news?" "My sister." Clara swallowed. "But her daughter, my niece Ruby, she needs a home. I could give her one at the ranch." "That would be wonderful!" Mrs. Lindell exclaimed. "A proper young lady to balance out all those reservation children. Though ... She glanced around and lowered her voice. "You might want to hurry with those plans. I heard Marshal Kincaid talking with that railroad man, Mr. Doyle, just yesterday. They seemed mighty interested in your property. Clara's spine stiffened. The railroad? Merritt Doyle's been buying up land all through the territory. Smooth talker, that one, but cold as a rattler's heart. Mrs. Lindell shook her head. Watch yourself, Clara. Men like that don't take kindly to their plans being disrupted. As if summoned by their conversation, the post office door swung open. Marshal Kincaid entered, his badge catching the sunlight. Behind him came a well-dressed man Clara didn't recognize, though his polished boots and calculating smile told her exactly who he must be. Miss Mallory. The marshal nodded curtly. Mr. Doyle here was just asking about your situation out at Apache Ranch. Merritt Doyle stepped forward, all charm and sharp edges. Miss Mallory, a pleasure. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad's Land Acquisition Office. I understand you've purchased the old Peterson place? I have. Clara met his gaze steadily. It's being put to good use. Ah, yes, your little school. Doyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. Admirable work, I'm sure. Though perhaps not the most practical use of such valuable property. The railroad's planning a spur line through this region. We'd be happy to discuss a generous offer for the land. It's not for sale, Mr. Doyle. Everything's for sale, Miss Mallory. It's simply a matter of price. He produced a business card. Do consider it. Progress waits for no one, after all. Clara didn't take the card. Good day, gentlemen. Outside, she hurried down the boardwalk, her mind churning. She needed to send a reply telegram about Ruby, needed to prepare the bunkhouse, needed to— Miss Mallory! Marshal Kincaid's voice stopped her. A word of advice? That Indian you're harboring, he has no legal claim to that land. Might want to consider Mr. Doyle's offer before things get complicated. Clara squared her shoulders. Is that a threat, Marshal? Just stating facts, ma'am. Railroad's coming, whether folks like it or not. She left him standing there, her steps quick and purposeful. The morning's joy over Ruby's telegram had soured, leaving a bitter taste of worry. But she wouldn't let fear rule her decisions. The ranch was home now, to her, to Taza, to the children who found safety within its boundaries. Soon it would be Ruby's home too. The sun was setting when Clara finally worked up the courage to tell Taza about Ruby. She found him by the fence line, watching the last light paint the hills gold. Without a word, he moved over on the rough-hewn bench he'd crafted, making space for her. Clara smoothed the telegram on her lap. I received news today, she began. My sister Sarah, she's passed on. Her daughter Ruby, she's 11. She needs a home. She glanced at Taza's impassive profile. I'd like to bring her here, but I wanted to discuss it with you first. Taza was silent for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. Finally he spoke, his deep voice gentle. All children need roots. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. Yes, they do. The house, he said, surprising her. It should be lived in again, not just remembered. Are you saying the girl should have a proper room, not the bunkhouse? He turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. Elena would have wanted it. Clara blinked back tears. Thank you. They sat together as darkness crept across the land, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara knew there were storms gathering. Doyle's threats, the marshal's warnings, the coming railroad. But for now, there was just the peaceful evening, the sound of crickets, and the knowledge that their strange partnership had grown into something neither had expected. Trust. Taza's voice broke the silence. The ranch is changing. Is that good or bad? He considered this. Change is like the wind, cannot stop it, but can choose how to bend with it. Clara thought of Ruby, of the children who came to learn, of the wildflowers taking root along the fence. We'll face whatever comes together. Taza nodded once, solemnly. In the growing dark, Clara could just make out the ghost of a smile on his face. Together they watched the first stars appear, each thinking of the challenges ahead, but finding strength in the simple fact that neither faced them alone. Back in town, in the county clerk's office, Merritt Doyle was already writing his petition for land reversal, his pen scratching across paper like claws on stone. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, there was only the quiet ranch, the promise of new beginnings, and two people who had learned that home wasn't just a place. It was the people who chose to stand their ground together. The mail wagon's wheels creaked to a halt in front of the ranch house, kicking up swirls of dust that caught the morning light. Clara stood on the porch, her heart thumping against her ribs as she watched the driver help a small figure down from the seat. Ruby Mallory clutched a worn leather Bible to her chest, her thin shoulders hunched beneath a faded calico dress that had seen better days. "Ruby," Clara called softly, stepping forward with open arms. The girl looked up, revealing dark circles under eyes too old for her 11 years. Her brown hair hung in two messy braids, and she seemed to shrink further into herself as she took in the weathered house and vast expanse of land stretching out behind it. "Aunt Clara?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Clara crossed the distance between them in quick steps, enfolding her niece in a gentle embrace. Ruby stood stiff for a moment before melting into the hug, her small frame trembling. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Clara murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry about your mama." The driver set Ruby's single carpet bag on the ground. "That's all she brought with her, Mum. Poor thing hardly spoke a word the whole journey." Clara pressed a coin into his palm. "Thank you for bringing her safely." As the wagon rolled away, a shadow fell across the yard. Ruby gasped and pressed closer to Clara's side. Tarza had emerged from the barn, his tall figure outlined against the morning sun. He carried a wooden pail in one hand and nodded once in greeting. "That's Tarza," Clara explained quietly. "He lives here too. He's been helping me fix up your room in the house." Ruby's eyes went wide with fear, her fingers digging into Clara's arm. Clara felt her heart twist. She'd expected this reaction, but it still hurt to see it. "It's all right," she soothed. "He's a friend. Would you like to see your room?" Ruby nodded, keeping her eyes down as they passed Tarza. He remained perfectly still, like a statue, understanding that sometimes the best way to ease fear was to give it space to settle. The room they'd prepared was small but bright, with fresh curtains Clara had sewn from flour sacks and a colourful quilt donated by Mrs. Lindell. A shelf held a few books, and a carved wooden horse stood proudly on the windowsill, Tarza's welcome gift, though Ruby didn't know it yet. "Is this all mine?" Ruby whispered. "All yours," Clara confirmed, watching as her niece ran a tentative hand over the quilt. "I know it's not much, but it's beautiful." Ruby's voice cracked. She sat on the bed, still clutching her mother's Bible. "Mama would have liked it." Clara sat beside her, careful to leave a little space. "Would you like to tell me about her?" And finally the dam broke. Ruby's words spilled out between sobs, about Sarah's long illness, about running their tiny household alone, about neighbors who helped until they couldn't anymore. Clara held her through it all, her own heart aching for her sister and this brave, wounded child. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Ruby spent most mornings helping Clara with household tasks, her movements careful and precise, like someone used to being useful. She watched Tarza from windows and doorways, ducking out of sight whenever he turned her way. But children's curiosity is a powerful force. One afternoon, while Clara was teaching at the makeshift schoolhouse they'd set up in the barn, Ruby found herself drawn to the soft scraping sounds coming from behind the house. There she discovered Tarza sitting in the shade, carefully sanding a piece of wood. He didn't look up or speak, just continued his steady work. Ruby inched closer, fascination temporarily overwhelming fear. "What are you making?" she finally whispered. Tarza held up the half-finished piece. It was beginning to take the shape of a deer. He offered her a small block of wood and a piece of sandpaper. "Like this." he demonstrated, his movements slow and deliberate. With the grain. Ruby hesitated, then sat on a nearby stump. Her first attempts were awkward, but Taza nodded encouragement. When Clara found them an hour later, Ruby was thoroughly absorbed in her task, a small pile of sawdust at her feet. The next day, Taza led his old mule, Bessie, from the barn. Ruby was reading on the porch when he stopped in front of her, holding the worn leather reins. "Would you like to learn?" he asked quietly. Ruby looked uncertainly at Clara, who nodded encouragement. "Bessie's gentle as a lamb, sweetheart, and Taza's the best teacher when it comes to horses." That first ride was just a slow walk around the yard, Taza leading Bessie while Ruby perched nervously on her back. But by the end, Ruby was sitting straighter, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. The arrival of Carney and the other children from the reservation brought another change. At first, Ruby hid in her room when they came for lessons, but one morning, Carney approached her with a handful of bright feathers and a shy smile. "For your hair," she said, demonstrating how to weave them into a braid. Clara watched from the schoolhouse door as the two girls slowly began to talk, their heads bent together over the feathers. By the end of the week, Ruby was joining in the lessons, her quiet voice growing stronger as she helped younger children sound out words. One evening, Clara found Ruby and Carney sitting cross-legged near Elena's grave, carefully arranging wild flowers around its base. Taza stood at the corner of the house, watching with an expression Clara had never seen before, something between pain and peace. "The children bring life back to this place," he said later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Like spring after winter." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The ranch had become more than she'd ever dreamed, not just a school or a home, but a place of healing for wounded hearts. The letter arrived the next morning. Clara's hands shook as she read the official county letterhead, "Notice of legal challenge. Re-property deed, Peterson Ranch, Township of Owl's Rest. To whom it may concern, this letter serves as formal notice that a legal challenge has been filed regarding the validity of your deed to the above-mentioned property. Allegations of improper sale procedures and current unauthorized occupancy must be addressed. You and any squatters currently residing on said property may face forced removal if this matter is not resolved within 30 days. Sincerely, Harold Fitch, County Recorder." Clara sank into her chair, the paper crumpling in her grip. Outside, she could hear Ruby's laugh mixing with the voices of the reservation children. Taza was teaching them to carve simple shapes, the sound of his deep voice carrying through the open window as he patiently corrected their technique. "More gentle," he was saying. "Let the wood tell you what it wants to be." Tears blurred Clara's vision. They had built something precious here, a family pieced together from broken pieces, a home that welcomed lost souls. The thought of losing it all made her chest ache with a physical pain. But as she watched Ruby emerge from behind the house, proudly holding up a roughly carved bird for Taza's inspection, Clara felt steel enter her spine. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about protecting the sanctuary they'd created, the trust they'd built, the healing they'd begun. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her Bible. There would be time enough to worry about legal challenges tomorrow. For now, she wanted to savor the sight of her niece's smile, the sound of children's laughter, and the quiet miracle of a family found rather than born. Ruby spotted her in the window and waved, her face glowing with achievement. Beside her, Taza nodded approval at her carving, and Clara saw her niece stand a little straighter, fear forgotten in the warmth of belonging. Whatever threats lay ahead, Clara knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight with everything she had to protect this precious new life they'd built together. Clara's boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk as she hurried toward the courthouse. The morning sun cast long shadows across Owl's Rest's dusty main street, and already the air held the promise of another scorching day. She clutched her documentation, deed papers, teaching records, and letters of support from Pastor Hobbs and Mrs. Lindell close to her chest. The courthouse stood imposing and official, its white-painted columns a stark contrast to the weathered buildings around it. Clara paused at the bottom of the steps, smoothing her best dress and whispering a quick prayer. Judge Harrison was a stern man with wire-rimmed spectacles and grey-streaked hair. He listened without expression as Clara presented her case, laying out not just the legal documents, but the human story. The children learning to read, Ruby finding her smile again, Taza sharing his knowledge of the land. "Mrs. Mallory," the judge interrupted, tapping his fingers on his desk. "I understand your humanitarian interests, but Mr. Doyle's petition raises valid concerns about proper land use and development." Clara straightened her spine. "Your Honor, that land is already being developed into something far more valuable than a railroad spur. We're building futures there." The judge studied her for a long moment. "I can give you 2 weeks," he finally said. "A temporary stay on any eviction proceedings. Use that time wisely, Mrs. Mallory." "Thank you, Your Honor." Clara's relief was tempered by the shortness of the reprieve, but it was something. A chance. The sun had set by the time she returned to the ranch, and the evening air was cooling rapidly. Ruby met her at the gate, face eager for news. Clara was just explaining the judge's decision when she noticed Taza's expression change. He was looking past her, toward the reservation. An orange glow flickered against the darkening sky. "The school tent," Taza said, already moving. Clara's heart lurched as she saw it too, flames reaching upward where their makeshift classroom stood. "Ruby, stay here!" Clara called over her shoulder as she and Taza ran toward the fire. The distance seemed endless, though they covered it in minutes. The canvas tent was fully engulfed, its supports crackling and groaning in the heat. Nietzsche was already there with several others, their faces grim in the firelight. "The children are safe," he reported tersely. "No one was inside." They could only watch as the flames devoured everything: the donated books, the slates, the careful drawings pinned to the tent walls. Clara's throat tightened as she thought of Connie's proud smile when she'd first written her name, of the younger children gathered around during story time. When the fire finally died down, leaving only smoldering ruins, Nietzsche spoke again. This was no accident. He pointed to a broken lantern lying several feet away, its glass shattered. Someone wanted to send a message. Clara looked at Taza, but his face was unreadable, carved from stone as he stared at the smoking remains. His silence spoke volumes. The walk back to the ranch seemed longer, heavier. Ruby was waiting on the porch, her face pale in the lamplight. "What happened?" she whispered. "The school tent burned." Clara answered honestly. She'd learned long ago that children deserved truth, even when it was difficult. Ruby's lower lip trembled. Will they burn our home too? The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She knelt in front of her niece, taking Ruby's small hands in hers. "Not while I'm breathing," she promised, her voice fierce with conviction. "This is our home, Ruby, all of ours, and we protect what's ours." Ruby threw her arms around Clara's neck, hugging tight. Over her shoulder, Clara saw Taza watching them, something shifting in his dark eyes. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Clara was already up, assessing what could be salvaged from the school tent, when Taza appeared with his tools and wagon. "We rebuild," he said simply. They worked through the morning, salvaging what they could from the ashes. A few books had survived, protected by a fallen piece of canvas. Taza carefully cleaned soot from the slate boards, while Clara sorted through half-burned papers. Children began arriving with their parents, bringing what they could spare: pieces of lumber, nails, even precious books. Nietzsche came with poles cut from young trees, already stripped and ready for a new frame. The message they meant to send, he said as they worked, was fear. He straightened, looking at the growing pile of materials. "Our answer is this." Clara watched as Ruby emerged from the house with a basket of biscuits she'd baked herself, offering them shyly to the workers. Connie appeared with her arms full of wildflowers, declaring they would make the new school beautiful. Taza worked steadily, his skilled hands shaping wood and securing joints. Sometimes he would pause, looking at the children playing nearby, and Clara could almost see him remembering his daughter. But now the memory seemed to strengthen rather than wound him. By midday, the framework of a new structure stood where the tent had been, smaller, but more permanent. Clara ran her hand along a rough-hewn beam, feeling the promise in its solid presence. "They meant to destroy us," she said quietly to Taza as they paused for water. "But look what they built instead." He nodded, watching as Ruby helped Kani practice her letters in the dust with a stick. "Some fires bring new growth," he replied. "The land knows this." Clara thought of the 2 weeks stretching ahead, of the battles still to come. But looking at their small community working together, she felt something stronger than fear. They had built this with trust and hope, nail by nail, lesson by lesson. No one could burn that away. The new school would be stronger than the old. And so would they. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when hoofbeats echoed across the ranch yard. Clara looked up from where she was hanging wash, her hands freezing on a damp sheet as 3 riders approached. Her heart sank when she recognized Marshal Kincaid's stern face among them. The marshal dismounted first, his boots raising small clouds of dust. He adjusted his badge before pulling a folded paper from his vest. "Mrs. Mallory," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I have federal orders here." Taza emerged from the barn, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He stood quietly, watching, as the other 2 deputies kept their hands near their gun belts. "What orders?" Clara asked, though dread had already settled in her stomach like a stone. Marshal Kincaid cleared his throat. "You are hereby ordered to vacate this property immediately." He turned to face Taza. "And you, sir, are under arrest for unlawful squatting on federal land." "This is his home," Clara protested, stepping forward. "He has every right—" "The law says different, ma'am." Kincaid's voice was flat, emotionless. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ruby appeared on the porch, her face pale with fear. "Aunt Clara!" "Stay there, sweetheart," Clara called, trying to keep her voice steady. She turned back to the marshal. "This is wrong, and you know it." Taza hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He stood like a mountain, watching the deputies approach with iron shackles that gleamed dully in the morning light. "Run," Clara whispered to him, her voice breaking. "Please." But Taza shook his head once, slowly. He held out his wrists, and the sound of the shackles closing around them struck Clara like physical blows. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as the deputies led him to their horses. Word must have spread quickly because townsfolk were gathering at the fence line, watching silently as the marshal's party prepared to leave. Clara saw Mrs. Lindell among them, her hand pressed to her mouth. Pastor Hobbs stood with his hat in his hands, head bowed as if in prayer. Ruby ran down from the porch and grabbed Clara's apron, burying her face in the fabric. "They can't take him," she sobbed. "They can't." Clara wrapped her arms around the girl, her own tears falling freely now. She watched as they helped Taza mount, his hands bound before him. He looked back once, his dark eyes meeting hers across the yard. In them, she saw not defeat, but a quiet dignity that broke her heart anew. The small procession moved out, hooves kicking up dust that caught the morning light like golden mist. Clara held Ruby until they disappeared from view, leaving only silence and the soft sound of their mingled crying. As evening approached, Clara sat at her small desk, composing a telegram with trembling hands. The lamp cast a warm glow on the paper as she wrote to Jonathan Wells, an old lawyer friend in Santa Fe who had helped her years ago when she'd faced losing her school in Kansas. "Need urgent help, stop legal injustice. Apache Ranch, stop, will pay any fee, stop, please, come quick, stop." Later that night, unable to sleep, Clara found herself walking to Elena's grave. The stone stood silent in the starlight, guardian to so many secrets and sorrows. She knelt beside it, folding her hands. "Lord," she prayed aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Give us strength. Show us the way through this darkness. Protect him, wherever they've taken him. Help us make this right." Small footsteps approached, and Ruby appeared like a ghost in her white nightgown. In her hands she carried one of Tarza's carvings, a delicate wooden horse he'd made her just days before. Carefully she placed it beside the gravestone. "He's not bad, is he?" Ruby asked softly, her young face troubled in the starlight. Clara reached out and pulled her close, breathing in the clean scent of her hair. "No, sweetheart," she answered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's the best man I've ever known." Together they sat in the cool night air, keeping vigil beside the grave of Tarza's wife, while somewhere in the darkness iron shackles clinked against a prison wall. The territorial courthouse loomed over the dusty square, its wooden columns casting long shadows in the morning sun. Clara smoothed her best black dress, the fabric worn but clean, as she climbed the steps with Nige beside her. Her heart thundered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high. Inside, the courtroom smelled of pine wood and tobacco. Light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Clara's shoes clicked against the floorboards as she made her way to the front, where Tarza sat between two deputies. His hands were still bound, but his posture remained proud. Judge Harrison peered down from his bench, spectacles glinting. "This hearing concerns the matter of tribal occupancy on federally deeded land," he announced, his voice filling the crowded room. "Mrs. Clara June Mallory, you wish to address the court." Clara rose slowly, clutching Elena's leather-bound documents. "Yes, Your Honor." She glanced at Ruby, who sat with Mrs. Lindell in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Proceed," the judge said, settling back. Clara took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I have here the original treaty documents concerning this land." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the yellowed papers. "With your permission, I'd like Nige to translate as I read the relevant passage." The judge nodded, and Nige stepped forward with the young Navajo interpreter, standing there. Clara's voice grew stronger as she read. "Article 7 clearly states that ancestral burial grounds shall remain undisturbed, protected by tribal law and federal statute." She paused as Standing Bear translated the words into Navajo, then continued. "Elena Yazi, Tarza's wife, was laid to rest on that land according to sacred custom. These documents prove her family's connection to that ground stretches back 3 generations." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Do you have supporting testimony?" "I do, Your Honor." Clara gestured to the back of the courtroom, where an elderly man in a weathered cavalry uniform stood slowly. "Name yourself," the judge commanded. "Colonel James Whitman, retired, Your Honor." The old soldier's voice was rough but clear. "I served with Tarza 15 years ago when he was an Army scout. Never met a man with more honor or courage. Saved my whole unit from an ambush in 72. That man's word is his bond." Tarza's expression remained unchanged, but Clara saw his shoulders straighten slightly at the colonel's words. "Furthermore," Clara continued, pulling out another document, "I have here a petition signed by 43 citizens of Owl's Rest, including Pastor Hobbs and the reservation agent, supporting our request to establish a joint trust for the property's use as both sacred ground and a school for children of all backgrounds." The judge studied the papers carefully, then removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. The courtroom held its breath. "This requires further review of precedent," he said finally. "I'll need time to consider the full implications." He paused, looking directly at Tarza. "However, I see no reason to keep the defendant imprisoned while we await a final ruling. Release him." The sound of the key turning in Tarza's shackles seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. As the iron fell away, Ruby burst from her seat and ran forward, throwing her arms around his waist. Clara followed more slowly, tears blurring her vision as she reached them. Tarza's face remained carefully composed. but when Clara looked up, she saw moisture gathering in his dark eyes. He placed one hand gently on Ruby's head and the other on Clara's shoulder, the touch speaking volumes his words could not. "Let's go home," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright afternoon sun, their shadows merging on the wooden steps as they descended. The battle wasn't over, but for now, they were whole again. The morning after the court hearing, Clara stood on the ranch's front porch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. A telegram from Santa Fe lay open in her hands, its message both surprising and hopeful. The territorial governor's office had agreed to review their petition for joint tribal stewardship. "Good news?" Taza's deep voice came from behind her. He had emerged silently from the barn, a habit that still startled her sometimes. "The governor's office will consider our case," Clara said, turning to face him. "Naicha has offered to speak on our behalf. He says he'll testify about the sacred nature of the land and the value of what we're trying to build here." Taza nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Naicha is respected. His words carry weight." Clara folded the telegram carefully. "I was thinking, perhaps it's time we started on the schoolhouse. Show them we mean business." A ghost of a smile touched Taza's lips. "I have boards cut already." They began work that very morning. Taza had indeed prepared lumber, stacked neatly behind the barn. Clara marked out the foundation while he drove stakes into the hard earth. Ruby emerged from the bunkhouse, eager to help, and Clara set her to sorting nails. The work was steady and methodical. Taza's experience in carpentry showed in every precise measurement and clean cut. Clara remembered the house he had built for Eleanor. Standing strong despite years of desert winds, this new building would carry the same care, the same promise. Word spread through town. Pastor Hobbs arrived one afternoon with his wagon piled high with extra lumber. "Thought you might could use these," he said simply, helping Taza unload. Mrs. Lindell, the postmistress, brought 3 boxes of books she'd been collecting. "Every school needs a library," she declared, as Ruby's eyes lit up at the sight of the volumes. Even those who didn't come to help seemed to soften their opposition. Clara overheard whispers in the general store about how maybe that Indian school ain't such a bad notion after all. The walls rose steadily over the next week. Ruby took particular joy in painting them, carefully coating each board in clean white. "It looks like clouds," she said proudly, paint splattered across her apron. One evening, as the sun was setting, Clara walked to Elena's grave. The wildflowers she had planted weeks ago now bloomed in brilliant patches of purple and gold around the stone. Their sweet scent mingled with the desert sage on the evening breeze. She stood there quietly, thinking of how life could spring from loss, beauty from pain. She would have approved, Taza said softly, appearing beside her. "Elena always wanted to teach." Clara nodded, touched by this rare mention of his wife. "I hope she knows her resting place will help children learn and grow." "She knows." Taza's voice held quiet certainty. The next morning, Clara discovered a new addition to the schoolyard. A sturdy wooden bench sat beneath the largest mesquite tree, its surface smooth as silk. Carved into the underside were 2 simple initials, C and T. "For the children," Taza said when she found him. "To rest between lessons." But Clara understood the deeper meaning in those carved letters. They represented not just their names, but their shared purpose, their unexpected partnership in building something meaningful from the ashes of loss. She ran her fingers over the initials, feeling the careful grooves Taza had carved. "It's perfect," she said softly, and meant far more than just the bench. The schoolhouse was nearly complete now, standing proud against the desert sky. Its fresh white walls gleamed in the morning sun, a beacon of hope rising from the dusty earth. Inside, Ruby was arranging Mrs. Lindell's books on shelves Taza had built, humming quietly to herself as she worked. Clara watched her niece through the doorway, then turned to see Taza installing the last window. They caught each other's eyes and held the gaze for a moment, sharing a look of quiet satisfaction. The building before them was more than wood and nails. It was proof that new dreams could take root in even the most wounded soil. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by Mrs. Lindell herself, who had ridden out specially from the post office. Her eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement as she handed the official envelope to Clara. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she broke the territorial governor's seal. Taza stood nearby, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning sun. Ruby pressed close to Clara's side, holding her breath. "By order of the territorial governor," Clara read aloud, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The land known as Mallory Ranch is hereby designated as protected trust property, to be held jointly by Clara June Mallory and Taza of the Chiricahua Apache people, with oversight from the Reservation Council." She looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "It's done. The land is ours. Together." Taza's weathered face remained solemn, but his dark eyes shone with emotion. He reached out and touched the paper gently, as if ensuring it was real. "Your word was true," he said softly. "You kept faith." Mrs. Lindell clapped her hands together. "Oh, this is wonderful news. And wait until you see tomorrow's paper. Editor Mackenzie is calling it a novel compromise. First time anything like this has been done in the territory." Ruby tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Can I ring the bell now?" "The new school bell?" Clara laughed, wiping her eyes. "Yes, dear heart. Go ahead." The girl raced to the schoolhouse, her boots kicking up dust. The bright copper bell hung proud beside the door, a gift from Pastor Hobbs's congregation. Ruby grabbed the rope and pulled with all her might. The clear, strong tone rang out across the desert, echoing off the distant hills. Birds took flight from the mesquite trees. Even the old mule in the corral lifted his head to listen. Clara watched Ruby ring that bell, her heart so full it ached. This was what she had dreamed of when she first stepped off that stagecoach, a place of purpose, of healing, of new beginnings. But she had never imagined how much richer that dream would become, shared with others who needed it just as deeply. The afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations as word spread. Naich came with several tribal elders to offer blessings. Mrs. Lindell returned with a cake. Even Marshal Kincaid stopped by briefly, touching his hat in a gesture of grudging respect. As evening approached, Clara and Taza sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. They were both exhausted, but contentment radiated from their quiet smiles. The official paper lay between them on the wooden bench, the one bearing their carved initials. Through the window, they could see Ruby curled up by the fireplace, her head pillowed on her arm. The girl had finally worn herself out after a day of celebration. "She's safe here," Taza murmured, his deep voice gentle as he watched the sleeping child. Clara turned to look at him, really look at him, this man who had started as her adversary and become something else entirely. Partner? Friend? Fellow guardian of this sacred ground? "So are you," she said softly. Taza was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the darkening sky. Then he nodded slowly. "Then I reckon I'll stay." The simple words carried the weight of a vow. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but she blinked them away, smiling. They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared, each lost in private thoughts of how far they had come and all that lay ahead. The land would hold their stories now, all of them. Elena's eternal rest, Ruby's second chance, Clara's renewed purpose, Taza's path to healing, and tomorrow the sounds of children learning would echo across the desert, proof that even the deepest wounds could birth new hope. Weeks drifted into summer like cottonwood seeds on the breeze. The ranch hummed with new life, a stark contrast to the silent, haunted place Clara had first encountered. Morning brought the clip-clop of ponies carrying children from the reservation, their laughter mixing with the desert wren's songs. By midday, The schoolhouse windows stood wide open, letting out the sounds of chalk on slate and young voices sounding out their letters. Clara paused in her sweeping to watch Ruby at work. Her niece sat cross-legged on a blanket under the big mesquite tree, surrounded by 3 small children. Her finger traced steadily across a primer as she helped them sound out simple words. The sight brought tears to Clara's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of pride. "Cat?" Ruby said clearly, then waited as little Sarah, a shy Apache girl, repeated it. "Very good!" Ruby beamed, looking so much like a proper teacher that Clara's heart swelled. In the vegetable patch, tender green shoots pushed through the dark soil. Corn, beans, and squash planted in the traditional Three Sisters method Taza had shown them. Clara marveled at how the land responded to care, as if it had just been waiting for the right hands to tend it. That evening, as she sat at her small desk in the bunkhouse, Clara dipped her pen in ink and began a letter to her sister. "Dearest Margaret, what I bought for $1 turned out to be priceless. You wouldn't recognize this place now. Where there was dust and despair, there's now purpose and joy. Ruby has blossomed like a desert flower after rain. She's teaching the little ones to read, and her patience would make any mother proud." Through the open door, she could hear Taza's deep voice carrying across the yard. He sat on his carved bench, surrounded by children and a few parents who often lingered after lessons. His hands moved expressively as he shared stories of the old ways, tales of coyotes' tricks and the sacred mountains, teaching history and wisdom together. Clara smiled, remembering the silent man who had first greeted her with an axe and cold eyes. Now his voice filled their evenings, his quiet laugh no longer rare. He'd built them all a home here, piece by piece, story by story. The sun began its descent, painting the western ridge in shades of amber and rose. Clara set down her pen and walked the familiar path to Elena's grave. Fresh wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze, yellow brittlebush and purple desert lupine that Clara had planted months ago. They flourished here, as if Elena's spirit nurtured them. Clara knelt beside the wooden cross, touching it gently. "He kept his promise," she whispered. "Your land is protected, your memory honored, and he's found peace here, I think." The crunch of boots on gravel made her turn. Taza stood a few paces back, his tall frame silhouetted against the sunset sky. His hand was outstretched, a gesture that had become their evening ritual. He would walk her back to the bunkhouse, their comfortable silence worth more than words. Their bond wasn't what folks might expect. They weren't lovers, never would be. But they were family all the same, bound by something deeper than romance, by shared grief transformed into purpose, by promises kept and trust hard won, by the miracle of hope built from nothing but $1 silver and a leap of faith. Clara took his offered hand and rose. Together they walked back toward the warm lamplight spilling from the windows, toward Ruby's voice reading an evening story, toward the future they'd built from the ashes of their past. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while, subscribe, and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.